Okay. Um, and I welcome everybody who's here. We have a nice little group. Hi, Denise. So I'm going to do a quick introduction, and then I'm going to ask Liz to talk a teeny bit about her book, and then I will ask questions. And I encourage the attendees to write questions in the chat, and we will address them either afterwards or as we're going along. And we're sort of thinking around 45 minutes, just so you have a sense of the time of the whole thing. So here I'm at the Dora Maar House. I hope everybody can hear me. Can everyone hear me? If you can't, say something in the chat. I know I'm in the office of the Dora Maar House, my office, and it's a little echoey. Yes. So I think pretty much everybody knows about the Dora Maar House. It's a residency program where Liz was here in 2018, 17? 18, right. We have writers and artists from all over the world, mid-career, on all kinds of disciplines. And we also have now a second building, the Hotel Tengri, which is a kind of cultural center. So if you're not familiar with our situation here, just check us out on the web at La Maison Dora Maar, at lamaisondormar.org or Dora Maar House. .org. And we've had a really busy summer, but we've been doing these webinars since the beginning of COVID, and it's a nice way for us to connect with our alumni who are far-flung all over the world, and to kind of talk about some of the work that they've done and work that they worked on while they were in residences is now finally coming out. And you worked on this book when you were here. I think you were working on it.
Yeah.
So Liz Brown's reviews and essays have appeared at Bookforum, Elle Decor, Frieze, London Review of Books, Los Angeles Times, New York Times Book Review, and most recently Slate. She is a recipient of a Wallis Annenberg Research Grant and has been a visiting writer at Wesleyan University, as well as a faculty member in the International Center for Photography-Bard MFA program in Advanced Photographic Studies. And she lives in LA. So you're in LA in the morning and I'm here in the evening. So it's really great to see you, Liz. Can you just give everyone a brief synopsis of the book? This is the book we're talking about, which will be backwards probably for you. I know there's a way to make it the other way around.
Yeah, it looks normal to me.
Oh, it looks normal? Okay.
Yeah.
Good. I've just finished it a few days ago, loved it. And I really encourage everyone to read it. But just give a summary kind of what the book is about.
Sure. It's definitely a epic, it's definitely a big saga with lots of plot swerves. But I think one of the most succinct ways to describe it is to say it's the story of about the secret lover of my great granduncle. The secret lover's name was Harrison Post, and he was a Hollywood socialite in the 1920s, 30s. And it's about his attempt to reclaim his stolen fortune. So that's essentially the plot. And his fortune was stolen because after his lover, William Andrews Clark Jr., who was a significant philanthropist who founded the LA Philharmonic and was instrumental in establishing the Hollywood Bowl. After Clark died, Harrison was supposed to inherit a great deal of money and had a trust set up, but he was convalescing from some kind of breakdown, whether it was a stroke or nervous breakdown is unclear. And his sister had him declared incompetent in 1934 and proceeded to drain his assets and dissolve the trust. And he ended up somewhat, I would say, destitute, and escaped her clutches with the help of a male nurse named Oscar Tryggestad, who took him to Norway in 1938, which, if you're thinking about world history, is a terrible time for a gay man of Jewish heritage to end up in what would soon be Nazi-occupied Norway. That is those are the significant plot points, but that's, yeah, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, don't want to give it all away. Um, but I want you to tell about your discovery of Harrison Post, because you didn't know about your uncle, your great uncle, right? Being
Great.
gay. Is that correct? Or did you know he was gay? And
I
tell me
knew
about
there was this, so I knew my grandmother I always would hear about Uncle Will and Aunt Alice, and they were almost sort of like these kind of ghostly celebrity figures in my grandmother's past that my mom would refer to. And I knew this Uncle Will was incredibly wealthy, and Aunt Alice was my grandmother's aunt, and my grandmother was named for her. And I knew there were these rumors about Uncle Will, and that his family was supposedly incredibly corrupt, and and that these rumors about Will included the fact that he had male lovers. And I had come out to my parents in the late 90s, and they really struggled with that in a very painful way. And so there was kind of a prolonged period of estrangement from my family when I was living in New York and they were all in California. And I didn't have much contact with them. But when my grandmother died, I went back for the funeral, and I was looking through her drawers and things just because I was kind of in this, I really wanted to feel connected to her because I'd been so disconnected from the family in general. And I had lived with her during high school. So I had a special bond with her.
Mm-hmm.
And I found this very alluring photograph in one of her drawers of the man who's on the cover. That same photograph I found.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And nobody knew who he was. It just said, "For Alice with best wishes," or something, Harrison Post, 1922. And my idea or fantasy was that he was a movie star that she had fandom or crush on, and she had as a teenager she would have, asked for, like, sent away for his autograph or something. And then several years later, as I was separately researching this mysterious Uncle Will, because I was at that point, things were improving a bit with my family, but I still was kind of longing for this familial longing to kind of find another connection to the family, and knowing that there might be a gay ancestor was really appealing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was researching Will Clark, unbeknownst that there would be any connection to the man in that photograph, and found this biography written about the Clark family, who I should say was this extraordinary Gilded Age empire. The Clarks made their wealth out of Montana copper during in the 1860s through the 1890s, and in this biography I found, which was written by an angry former employee, I found this amazing passage in which they talk about Will Clark's unnatural vices, and but the language they said, and then he gave the bulk of his estate to his perverted disciples, which included Harrison Post. And that was the first way I was able to identify him. And I wasn't looking for him.
Right.
I was, looking for the story of this uncle and my grandmother, and there he was.
And you had that photograph up on the wall in your house, right?
Yeah, I'd had it for several years at that point, and just had instinctively, for whatever reason, wanted to kind of salvage and put this man on display without knowing anything about his story.
Right. So it's kind of an uncanny, weird coincidence, which it seems like you've had that experience when you were doing this research, right?
Yeah, there are a lot there. That was a bit the pivotal one, or the initial one, but I've had that in terms of meeting this woman named Sue Lombardi, who was the niece of Harrison's foster sister. All the family connections are very circuitous. There's not, their niece, we're all sort of nieces or nephews of somebody in the story.
Yeah.
And Sue, who I met through the Clark Library, which is based here in LA and is now part of UCLA, but Will Clark founded it, and it has the largest repository of Oscar Wilde's letters and ephemera. And a librarian there put me in touch with this woman, Sue, who it turned out had Harrison's journals and scrapbooks from his time in Norway. And then it turned out that Sue, actually, through another coincidence, knew my parents, had met them, and it just, lately, I've been thinking about these really uncanny connections and the sort of serendipity, and I started to think that maybe because Harrison was gay and he was Jewish and he wasn't he entered this world of wealth that was like, I would call white wealth, like a very, he belonged to these clubs, which he wouldn't have if he was identified as Jewish. And he sort of penetrated this world that he wasn't supposed to. And I almost sort of feel like all these strange coincidences are kind of this, like in the mystical way, it's like he ripped a tear in the time continuum of white wealth in America, and there are these weird little cracks that keep sort of emerging.
It's funny because I also had that experience when you're doing this kind of research, where you almost have the sense that somebody's leading you, someone like they're leading you to find these things, because they're just so astonishing that you would stumble upon them, that you would hold on to that photo and put it on the wall, and then it's like there's a way that you were. It's really interesting, and Harrison is a complicated person, right? Because he changes his name several times. I mean, he goes through all kinds of identities, but he's not really a scam artist at all. He's I mean, that's the feeling I get. I mean, anyway.
Yeah. I sort of think of him like sometimes I think of him like a gay Great Gatsby, but sometimes I think of him like a gay Forrest Gump, or where he's sort of, or Zelig, where he kind of
is there all these pivotal moments,
but not out of his own volition. Just someone recently made the association to Candide, and I think that's another good kind of parallel. Someone who's somewhat haplessly keeps falling into into great luck and terrible luck.
Right.
He gets into.
How long did it take you to do the research for the book?
So I found that photograph in 2003, but I would say I didn't really start working on the research until about 2011, 2012.
So good 8-10 years.
2000, and I think, so it's been, I would say it's been a long 8, depending how you look at it, 8 to 10 years.
Yeah. And I was wondering about this book by Buck Morgan. Is it Mangum? So that was kind of an important book for you in the research, right? But it's a negative portrayal of your uncle or great uncle.
Yeah, it's very negative. It's called The Clarks, An American Phenomenon, and it was written by William Mangum, who was known as Buck, and he was a college friend of Will Clark's and his accountant for 30 years in Butte, Montana. So Will had moved to LA and kind of established himself there, but he still had business enterprises, and Buck ran them for him. And that book is it's a fascinating read. It's so angry and so kind of titillating too, with how much how the way he writes about Will's sex life, and I have always wondered where that anger comes from. He was fired, and that was something I discovered in my research. But there's something in the book that other people are fired and they don't write these scathing, angry trash.
Screes, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So you don't really know why Buck is so angry. What do you think?
He definitely, and he was in the midst of suing Will for defamation, which was an attempt to basically expose Will and his gay life and his relationship with Harrison when Will died. So, I mean, and that's something that also really stood out in the research was how gay men were hunted in a way. I mean, they were prey for blackmail and extortion. And Will, because he was so incredibly wealthy, was a huge target. And so in a way, I do think some of Buck Mangum's, his lawsuit was, in some ways, it seemed like a shakedown effort. But the publication of the book is something else, you know, that Will was dead by then. So it feels like it comes out of a different motive, not profiteering.
Right. And I'm so sorry, there's a little bit of background noise. I hope it's okay. What I wondered, like, what kind of resource? I know the source. One of the sources was, of course, the book, and then tell us a little bit about all the different. And then you mentioned the diaries and the journals, which you ran into, but to get those, you had to do a lot of other research.
Yeah.
What was I mean, because, and also you did it for so long. I mean, it took. What was that process like? What were some of your sources, and what was the research like?
Sure. Well, one, definitely the book by Buck Mangum, which I had to be careful of, and I definitely say that in Twilight Man, like, this is a complicated source because it's so angry, you have to question some of its veracity. But in addition to Harrison's journals, one of the big resources were archival legal files. Because he was declared incompetent, there's a huge case file that his sister, who her name was Gladys Crooks, was, which again is like one of the other things, you know, you wouldn't put that in a novel, but it's true. She was so that's like about a ream of paper.
How did you find that? And was it easy to access?
It was. It's in the Los Angeles Hall of Records in their basement, which is an extraordinary resource. And it took writing letters. It's complicated because you have to know what year you're looking for and who the names of the defendants and the plaintiffs are, and kind of narrow, and then you have to narrow down the case file number, and it requires a lot of patience getting those.
Persistence, maybe.
Yeah. So that was a big breakthrough. I went to Norway. I met a woman who was the niece of Oscar Tryggestad, the male nurse I mentioned earlier, and she remembered Harrison. She's still alive. She's in her 80s, but she was a little girl, about 8, when he came to Norway. And one of the most amazing moments was meeting her and her describing how particular and fastidious Harrison was about his clothing, and she'd made this gesture where she, was saying he had to have his sleeves just so, and she, gestured to her wrist. He was very adamant with the tailor about where his sleeves had to fall, and then I also met the son of the tailor, who was the only other person I met who knew Harrison, and was also a little boy at that time, a little kid, and he spoke only in Norwegian, so it was being translated, but he made the exact same gesture as he had. And this was, they were in 2 different cities. They had, they didn't, and I just thought it was such an amazing kind of an encounter with the memory of Harrison. Right. And it captured something about him that isn't in his journals. It was a really lovely moment to see that repetition.
Yeah, and so when he was in Norway, he was with the nurse. Were you able to find out anything more about the nurse?
Yeah, the nurse, Oscar Tryggestad, had this family home, or rather like a hotel in the town of Hellesilt, which is kind of sort of a stop on the cruise lines as they would go, the tourists going through the fjords. And so they would, so his sister ran it, and he would come home for the summers every year and stay there. But and that was where he took Harrison to recuperate. And his niece was helpful. And also one thing that was, and she took me through Oscar's photographs and his albums, which had many of the same photos as Harrison. But Harrison was fastidious about his clothing, but not about his record keeping. And his scrapbooks are very kind of hodgepodge, but Oscar's are very meticulous and orderly, and
they're so helpful.
It was so helpful in terms of research to have someone who was keeping careful record. And the townspeople today are very they're historians there. I mean, they have a local historian who was very helpful to me, and they do a book every year about some aspect of the town's history. So they had so that was really helpful. And there's a POW account written by a Norwegian about his period of incarceration and internment that has an entire chapter about Harrison in it. Which
that's great. That must have been
extraordinary windfall.
Yeah.
Those were big. Those were all those chunks really helped put it together.
So in a way, I mean, I know that you went to Norway, but really it's a story about LA, and you live in LA. I mean, did you feel that? Did you feel as you're researching, like, how much this is about the makeup of the city that you live in?
Yes. Because
or Hollywood.
Yeah, it is. And so, in the sort of line between Hollywood and LA gets so blurred, and you sort of think they're the same thing, but in writing this, I realized, like, there's Hollywood exists inside of Los Angeles, and it's its own, they overlap in so many ways, but Los Angeles was something else before Hollywood. It was a forming ranching settlement. And then it was an oil, it was oil fields, and then it was real estate development, and then it was Hollywood, and they overlap to a degree, but there's this kind of old money, and old is a
relative,
not European, terms of time, but California terms of time, that preceded Hollywood. And so Harrison belongs to kind of both of those worlds. And that was really interesting to kind of see that intersection, how he straddled this kind of elite industrial wealth and this world of this, this glamorous world of movie stars.
When did you know that the book was about that you were writing a book about Harrison and not about your Uncle Will? Or did it start out being a book about your Uncle Will, and then your Uncle Will and Harrison, and then it turned to Harrison? I mean, because it's, I'm curious of how that shifted in your...
I think it was always a book about Harrison, and I think because I feel more comfortable with people on the periphery in a way, story of people in the wings, or
margins,
the marginalized, or the interlopers, or something, people in proximity to wealth, but not necessarily at the center of it. And I think I was always going to be more attached to him. I also, there's very little correspondence between the two of them, and having Harrison's journals and I think having that window into his inner life was probably the deciding factor.
Uh-huh.
Maybe if I'd had Will's journals, it would be different. But Will is in some ways a darker figure, and I think that it was hard. It was hard to stay attached to him at times because he is a troubling, complex character. And Harrison, even though he's not necessarily full of virtue or something, his story was easier for me to stay close to. I don't know if that makes sense.
Again, did that surprise you, the discoveries about Will? I mean,
I think it was the kind of thing that that is one of those sort of things you're trying not to know. And
but maybe you should tell the people what it was.
Give you a little more context for this. So I started out thinking I'm going to write this story, this gay love story, and I'm going to kind of rescue these gay martyrs, because they were targeted and their lives were ruined by people who were exploiting the fact that it was criminal to be gay. But what complicated that is that Will was the son of like Jeff Bezos, and he was, and he took advantage of that wealth in ways that were really, it appears, I have to qualify that because I don't know this for definitively, but in the end of his life, it appeared that he was having, that he sort of fixated on the son of his housekeeper. And there's a way to look at that to think that this was a gesture of benevolence and he was a generous man. His own son had died tragically. He was, perhaps looking to have a kind of surrogate relationship. And so there's a way to look at that has a positive lens. There were also people who looked at that and saw and believed he was molesting the boy. So that really shatters any attempt to make this person into some kind of martyr, and it really, and that I think was really complicated because I was looking to kind of rescue this gay history, but it intersected with the abuse of wealth. So these men are on the one hand victims for their sexual orientation. On the other hand, they may be or at least in Will's case, may be doing monstrous things because he has a monster.
But then it's also hard to tell, right? Because they're marginalized, and that would be the accusation that would be thrown against them.
You're right. One thing that I will say though is that Will's father, Clark Sr., who was a senator and extremely corrupt in terms of bribing officials and bribing his way into the Senate and into other things. There's a sort of pattern in the Clark family, at least between Senior and Junior, in which they set their sights in a way on a young person. In Senior's case, it was a girl, and he transported her. Her name was Anna LaChapelle, and he transports her to France, sets her up, and has her to learn French and study music. And she was the daughter of a woman who ran a boarding house in Butte, Montana. And he sort of plunges her into this world of wealth and essentially grooms her. And she was 40 years his junior, and they eventually got married and had 2 children. And there was a lot of scandal about when they got married and whether she had children before they were married. But there's sort of, you see this kind of, almost like, I looked at it like a kind of monarchy of like a sovereign choosing his sort of kind of pig line, and then who will eventually be his queen or something. And that's how I looked a little bit at Will's relationship to the housekeeper's son, was that he was doing what had been modeled for him.
Right. Yeah. And I know you said that you couldn't you had no correspondence between them. And do you have a sense or an intuition about their relationship?
Yeah, I think in some ways their relationship was a kind of Pygmalion story, in that an older man taking a younger man in and kind of
A poor younger man.
yeah. And I mean, Harrison was a shop clerk in a luxury boutique. He wasn't I'm thinking of, he wasn't on the street, and he probably would have been fine if he had never met Will. I mean, he would have had probably a life as a shop clerk or something like that. But I do think sort of his introduction to Will it certainly transformed his life. And I think there may have been a kind of, in some ways, it echoed Oscar Wilde and Lord Alfred Douglas. And I think that what this sort of older man, younger man dynamic was common, and it still is. I mean, and not necessarily something that needs to be framed in terms of the way I was just describing, someone preying upon the son of a housekeeper. I think of it, just people of different ages fall in love and with different life experience. And I did think of in a way, perhaps their relationship as another thing that Will kept trying to recreate with later lovers and relationships, like sort of this young, beautiful man and bringing him into this wealth and kind of expanding his world in a way.
Right.
And that story turns darker and darker with each iteration of it. But I don't know if that quite gets at what the
I just wonder if you have had a feeling of how Harrison felt about Will.
He referred once to, he didn't write about him too often in the journals. He would say he referred to him as a great romance at one point, and referred to him as his best friend. And he would, every year on the day of his birthday, write and say, "I hope someone is putting flowers on his grave." I think, yeah, so Will's absence loomed over the rest of his life, certainly.
So I also wondered how your family feels about this book.
Yeah,
in a way, it is an ancestor, but it's an ancestor it's problematic, yes. And also it really does become a book about wealth, I think, right? And about the sort of the corruption of wealth. Yeah. Not just outwardly, but the corruption of that person, even their own life becomes kind of strange. I mean, even the way he brings all these bodies to be buried next to him of all these people who didn't want to be buried next to him. It's this kind of possessiveness that wealth allows. It becomes really, I don't know.
I think that's a great way that it's both outwardly and inwardly corrupting. My mom has read the book 3 times and is a huge fan, and that was not clear that it would go that way. So I don't know. I mean, I think her affiliation really is, to my grandmother and to my grandmother's aunt, because neither of them are they're bridges or entries, portals into this story, and both of them are unblemished, I would say, in this story. So I think that since that was all protected, or you
weren't taking away something.
Yeah, I wasn't taking that's such a good way to put it. I wasn't taking anything away. I think it definitely gives her a lot to think about that question about, maybe everyone would have been better off if there wasn't so much money.
Right. So tell me when you were at Dora Maar House, what stage were you on with the book? And
Uh,
what do you remember what you were able to do while you were here?
oh my God, that was such a dream. I just, that, like, that was such a magical time. And if I can remember right, I'm not sure where I was at which draft. I thought I was at I'm sure I thought I was finishing the final draft.
And what is never, right?
I wasn't. But it was the kind of thing where I was able to move very swiftly through a lot that had felt like a very incremental process of writing. Suddenly the tempo of it really picked up. So I can't say I remember exactly.
Did you have a contract already when you were at
Yeah,
Dora?
I did. Yeah. So I got the contract in 2014.
Okay.
And it kept, it was supposed to be 2 years, and it was not. But I just remember the kind of consistency of those days being really important to being able to sustain one idea and stay with it. I would have to go back and kind of look at what I wrote during that time to figure out, what were some of the breakthroughs. But really just that kind of constancy was fantastic. And
I can't remember who you were here with at
I
the
was
house.
Rosalie Hearse and
Oh yeah.
David Grand.
Okay.
And it was February or March.
March.
So it's the first, I think that's your first session in the season.
Right.
And I'll never forget like arriving the first night and just the incredible winds.
Oh, we had a Mistral.
It was incredible, and you could just hear it going through all the chimneys in the house. It was it was wonderful. I mean, I definitely knew I was somewhere else.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, we have a question from one of from Jan Philip. Wasn't he building his own gay family? I think so. So I think he's talking about Will.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that is another way to look at it. To the sort of story of Harrison and Will and this young boy whose name was George Palais, who was the son of the housekeeper. That is one way to look at it. And I do think, I mean, Will wanted to adopt my grandmother. So he definitely, this idea of adopting and kind of taking someone else's, raising someone else's child was a pattern for him, or the thing that is hard to know about, well, the thing that makes me question whether there's a darker element to the story of Will's interest in the housekeeper's son is, and this comes at the end of the book, and I don't want to give too much away, but that is the relationship that George had with his own son, who he named Clark, who was gay, and how brutal he was to that boy. And that, I mean, homophobia is nothing new, and but that story and his and his anger at that boy's effeminacy and gayness felt like, is it coming from something in his own past? And that's why I have a hard time just thinking that's why I feel like there's something darker to that relationship. But that is, I mean, I do think it is possible to imagine there was a kind of gay family.
So what would you like people to take away from the book? Like, or what do you feel? I mean, is that might be too oversimplifying, but I've been asked that question, so I thought I'd ask you.
No, I like it. I think for me, it's taken me a long time to understand if there's any way to have closure with this story, because
Uh-huh.
it's, not to, well, it's not a triumphant ending. It doesn't have Harrison's story doesn't end with triumph, um and it might not have there might not be a kind of traditional catharsis with it that you want in a narrative, but I feel like the catharsis or the closure, I think, happens in the reader taking in the story and knowing Harrison's story, because he was erased for so long, and these gay stories have been erased from so much history, that to simply know it, even if it's not doesn't have a triumphant aspect or doesn't have a easy or positive kind of form of closure, I still feel like that in itself, the witnessing to these erased men
Right.
is cathartic, and is like the redemption.
And in a way, I think when you write nonfiction, you won't have like the perfect narrative arc, because that's not,
Never,
life
yeah,
isn't that way. Life is, it just isn't that way, you know.
yeah,
And yeah, bearing witness is a really important. Bearing witness certainly of the marginalized, effaced from history is a really important task, I think.
yeah.
So tell me, do you if anyone has any questions, speak up or type them. But Liz, are you working on a new project? Have you had time yet since turning in the book?
Yeah, I have, and I'm working on two very different things. One is an essay about a gay archivist who has a really interesting link between Butte, Montana, and San Francisco, and then one is a screenplay that's a female buddy action movie. So, and that is very pleasurable, and doesn't involve I don't have to go to the LA Hall of Records for that. So I do enjoy doing that, but it has a very different tempo in terms of writing and research.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that, because I sort of fell in love with archives and research, but it is a kind of slow process, right?
Yeah.
And you kind of geek out over one little teeny link that could lead to something. You spend a week on it or whatever, versus writing fiction. And I was wondering, just in terms of your process, like, did you do all the research and then start writing, or were you kind of writing as you went along?
I wish I had done that, and no, I wrote and researched at the same time, and I was researching up until the very end. And I can see that it would have been much easier to just do a big chunk of research and then a big chunk of writing, and but that's,
I don't know. I mean, I wrote and researched at the same time, and I think it's almost because the writing is the way you think through what you're learning.
Yes.
It's kind of a way to work out the ideas, maybe. I don't know, something like that. So the buddy movie, and then you also just finished an article, which was really interesting. We were talking about before we started about the parallels between. You can explain that.
Sure, I'll tell you. So Britney Spears, if people are familiar with the news story about her having been declared incompetent and this conservatorship that has governed her life for the past 13 years. I wrote about that recently for Slate, because not only I was interested in her story because just of the human kind of terrifying aspect of it, and also because it had such parallels to Harrison's story. And in the process of just reading through the news accounts, I discovered that her court-appointed attorney, whose name is Samuel D. Ingham, was the grandson of the neurologist who had Harrison declared incompetent in 1934. They have the same name. They're both Samuel D. Ingham. And which was just an extraordinary link. And I already knew these stories were very similar. And so I wrote a piece in Slate about that. And one thing I didn't have the space to kind of write about is, because we were talking about this before, you know, how many men can have mental health issues, addiction issues, and not lose access to their estate and control of their body, and not be declared incompetent. And I would say that the way Harrison was treated in some ways the way, very much because he was gay, was not accorded the sort of autonomy we accord straight men.
Right. The agency, yeah.
Yeah, the
kind of
agency.
one woman. Right.
Exactly, and it's similar with women, in the same way that it is so easy for the court system to decide they should be denied agency. And so it's very easy for the court system to decide this man should be denied agency.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I mean, some elderly people
Yes.
are also very vulnerable to this kind of, and if it is a kind of a family industry, like you were saying, it's really sinister, you know?
It's really sinister if it is, or if it's simply this attorney looking at what his grandfather did and deciding this would be a profitable line of work.
Right.
So
That's so interesting.
he has resigned. I will say that once the spotlight shone on him so brightly, he jumped out of it. So
Right, interesting. Well, I think, you know, that's where we've been talking for 50 minutes, and I don't know if does anyone else have any questions from the attendees? You know, speak now. But thank you really so much. I loved reading the book. Partly it's just such an interesting kind of look at that time period between the wars and Hollywood and America and the whole, you know, these rising huge families, aristocracy, and then the other story. Oh, I wanted just in closing, because this is a question I wanted to ask you, or at least I think you'd speak about a little bit in the book, but why the title? Because I think it's a really interesting.
Oh, sure. That Twilight Man was a term used in the 1930s for gay men. It wasn't, I don't think it was in vogue very long, and I don't know among what groups it was in vogue. I don't know that gay men referred to themselves as Twilight Men, but it was, there was a kind of sort of pulp fiction novel written in 31, I think, called Twilight Men, the story of a homosexual, and in a very sympathetic book. And I had never come across the term until I read Buck Mangum's book, and he refers to Harrison both as a degenerate of the Oscar Wilde sort and the type known as Twilight Men or something like that. That was my first encounter with the term.
Very euphemistic, yeah.
Very much, yeah.
So yeah, I love the title, actually. I think it's really great. So thank you so much. When Liz is back, you'll have to autograph Jan's book. Thank you, everybody. And Liz, when I see you next, you have to autograph my copy.
I would
just
be
quite
glad.
dog-eared right now.
I hope it's back in Minerve.
yeah, exactly. So thank you so much, everybody, and thank you.
Thank you, Gwen.
Thank you. And you know, talk about the book and help, you know, spread the word. Thank you so much. All right, bye-bye.